ladies and gentlemen. First of all, of course, I like to thank all the people who have been inviting me here. It's nice to be back in Belgrade. It's been quite a few years I visited this city before, and it is, especially the river is so amazing. Many cities have rivers, but you have something different. But yes, I am talking more about the equipment, what we have started to use recently, and not so much about any patient work. But so this is sensory motor control with the EMG equipment, and there are about 100 working EMG equipment around the world at the moment, and usually the clinical applications, they are like pre-surgical localization for epileptic foci, and then pre-surgical mapping of eloquent areas in the cortex for motor functions and for hearing and vision. And we in our university were able to purchase one MEG equipment, but we are not really in a clinical setting at the moment, and this is more used for psychological studies on learning and cognition, development across lifespan, also like gerontological studies, and especially physical activity, sports, motor control, and health and well-being. So this is more on health sciences niche, what we are trying to fill in with this equipment. What we have is a new system which has an internal helium recycler, because the MEG is a difficult issue because of the cooling of the squids, cooling of the sensors, and the helium is an expensive material to use every week, and so this is the newest development there. And I have a few words about the background of MEG. Finns were early on very keen on developing this technology, and the Elekta was the company in the first place. Then it was owned by the Swedish company, and it was again sold about a year ago to York Instruments, and then nowadays it is a part of Croton Healthcare, so it has changed recently hands in several times, but still over 100 equipment really are in use. And so what we have here is the equipment, and the sensors are in the liquid helium, and the whole equipment is in a shielded room, magnetic shielded room, so it cannot be moved anywhere. The patient or a subject can lie down or sit, and we can stimulate various issues. We can record also EEG at the same time if we would like to. There are all the sensors, stimulation, and we can then localize the activity. And what the signal actually then is, how it does differ from EEG signal. What we have here is the postsynaptic potential, which is occurring in the higher top layers of the cortex, and this current produces a magnetic field around it, and this magnetic field is then picked up by the sensors in the helmet. And what is so nice about it is that it is of course, we get the very high temporal resolution, such like EEG has. It is completely passive, it is completely silent, it is completely non-invasive, there is no radiation. So we get a much better spatial resolution than EEG, but of course the basic cost of equipment is much more than in EEG. There are a number of areas where MEG is used, audition, visual, cognition, and also to sensory motor research here, and that sensory motor research is where we have been active recently. So I'd like to talk about a little bit of the voluntary movement studies we have had. Then automatic somatosensory mismatch studies, and also some pain-related somatosensory studies. And why would we talk about voluntary movement? Like Natalie already said, it appears that we know where the motor cortex functions and how the sensory processing happens after that, but there are very many little things we still don't understand in the control of reaction time or self-paced movements, and this is one we tested out. Then somatosensory function is not so often studied in this connection with mismatch. Mismatch means that there is a continuous stimulus stream, and that stream is then interrupted by some different very close stimulus. And mismatch occurs when the deviance is detected in the brain. And so it is mostly studied in and very widely studied in auditory system, because, for instance, speech understanding is very much related to understanding the deviance of the next syllable from the previous one. But, so there is also visual studies in mismatch response, but very little on somatosensory. And I don't see why the somatosensory system wouldn't be as sensitive as auditory or visual system to detect a deviance in the incoming sensory stream. So that's why we looked at also the sensory mismatch, and I need to still point out that it is completely automatic, so it happens all before 250 milliseconds, so there is no cognition-related component in that. And then still going back to the equipment studies, that we had this new equipment, which is very, very sensitive to all electrical noise. We tried to develop a pain-related stimulus system for that, and that's the third thing I'm quickly going to go through. So this is about the voluntary movement execution. We had 18 subjects here and had a similar task for reaction time and self-paced movement recorded first in the interosseous dorsalis EMG, and they performed a reaction time movement to the radial nerve stimulus and a same amount of self-paced movements in their own time without any cues. And we have the right hand was moving, and here we have the reaction time, all the channels shown, reaction time movement and any self-paced movement. And you can already see that there are some differences in the waveforms. And the waveforms are a little better shown here. So all the gradiometer data is described in here, and this is the reaction time, and this is the self-paced task. And 0 is where the EMG started, so this black line shows where the stimulus came, so there is clearly a preparatory activity before the EMG. Motor field appears at the time of EMG, and then motor evoked field after that. And the self-paced movement, the same EMG starts here, and we have an activation before, and the movement evoked field is about 100 milliseconds later. And so further on this, we used scout functions to detect the sources of these activations. Here are the reaction time EMGs first and self-paced movement EMGs. And what this ripple here is the stimulus artifact of the radial nerve stimulation. So this shows the variation in reaction times there. And what we see in source activities, the red one is the reaction time source, and 0 is where the EMG started. So there is stronger movement field for the reaction time, and then for the movement evoked field, here we also see the reaction time having a higher higher source activation. Here we see further the same scout waveforms and also the RF, so readiness field, movement-related cortical field, or Bereitschaft field, if you like, where the blue one, which is the self-paced movement, has a little higher activation than the reaction time. Here we have the early 70 millisecond activations in the motor cortex for the reaction time self-paced movement, and then for the about 100 milliseconds for the movement evoked field here. And what we can say all together, the sources what we were able to localize for movement field and movement evoked field, they were in primary motor cortex and primary sensory cortex based on NMI coordinates. And the readiness field, which is often thought to originate from SMA, it is not easily seen in the MEG signals. This has been also shown previously in other MEG equipment. It may be that one main reason is that MEG is seeing more the tangential oriented currents than EEG, and then the very radial currents now don't necessarily show up so well. It may also be that there is a tangential activation in the SMA which cancels each other, because on both sides of the central sulcus. But we still saw that the self-paced movement produced a slightly stronger readiness field than the reaction time movement, and it may well be that the reaction time movement, when there is a preparatory phase, there is more activity inhibited actively than in the self-paced movement. So M1 was more active than in reaction time movement, and also movement-related evoked field in the somatosensory cortex peaked earlier than in the self-paced movement. And they also differed very clearly in the anterior-posterior direction, the movement field and movement evoked field. So this also supports the idea that they really were on M1 and S1 areas. So then another one is this automatic somatosensory mismatch I promised to talk to you about. And so really in auditory system there is a lot of work on that. It is thought that this mismatch negativity in general is associated with all involuntary attention orientation. So you have to orient to something accidentally new before you can behave and react to that stimulus. And so very little is done on somatosensory system. Actually, what happens in mismatch research is that the continuous stimulus is important, the so-called standard stimulus, because that generates the memory base, memory structure from which the new disturbing signal is compared. So the deviant stimulus is kind of just necessary there. It is more important to have the standard stimulus. But so what we did with the somatosensory mismatch, we studied with fingers with electrical stimulation, with fingers in tactile stimulation, the same with those. And what actually was the idea, because you have to have a mismatch. So we used location mismatch so that you had one for index finger and one for middle finger. And of course, you would easily say that yes, of course you have a different location for index and middle, index finger and little finger on the motor cortex, but no, we switched them so that the actual testing was of whatever was deviant, whatever was different from the standard stimulation And these are, we used ring electrodes, we used tactile air puff stimulation for toes and fingers too. Here is an example of a gradiometer recording where the blue one is the standard stimulation, and then this is the deviant stimulation, producing a nice mismatch here. And close by sensor location shows a very nice dipolar possibility to localize a dipolar source there. And what we have here is for foot stimulation, we have the deviants here, and the deviant mismatch is shown here, and this is the standard stimulation for foot, so that was also an interesting aspect in that. So electrical and tactile stimulation are important to compare because tactile is really a more natural issue. So electrical is easy to use in clinic quickly, but what really mimics normal life better is the tactile stimulation. So we looked at the possible differences of electrical and tactile mismatch responses, and yes, we had the 40-50 millisecond responses, and there is a difference already in there. But longer latency stimulation at about 100-180 milliseconds, where we see the window where the changes are, there was a more tactile activation and more bilateral activation. So electrical stimulation only went to the contralateral side for S1 and S2 areas, so for secondary sensory area 2, but the tactile stimulation was bilateral. And of course, we think that why we get the bilateral activation, it may be that already in that early time there is an integration of both body sides, with the electrical stimulation being more unnatural, may not be present there. But then with the sensory system, we got interested also that if we get just using radial nerve stimulation, a S2 and operculo-insular activation, so we are close to the areas where we should also see pain-related responses. And because the MEG is so very sensitive, you can't bring into the shielded room very strong electrical devices at all. And so we tried to develop something where we can get painful stimulation with very little electrical current. And so why would that be of interest in our area, because we are talking about health sciences and sports sciences, is that most of you know very well from your own practice that when your knee is hurting, when you do tens of kicks, then maybe the pain reduces. What actually happens in exercise-induced hyperalgesia, we have very little understanding of that. And I think that we might have a way of looking at exercise-induced hyperalgesia through these methods. So ultimately, we wish to look at that. We'll see when we get there. But so this was one of the pieces of work which also led to that, because we were able to see that when stimulating just the radial nerve on the surface of the skin, we were activating bilaterally on both S2 areas, operculo-insular areas, the somatosensory cortex, and with the electrical stimulation, there was not such activation. So this is at the same time period than the somatosensory mismatch would be. So we tried to get this painful stimulus so that we poured a little hole into the middle finger and put a little very small copper electrode into the hole, and thus we were able to give very, very low current, and it still feels very stinging. And what I'm trying to show here is that this is all the planar craniometers of this pain-evoked field, and if we use the same current with the surface electrodes on the same area, we do get very much a different picture of the activation. So what we did with these pain-related fields is that first of all, we have the 45 millisecond response here. On blue we can see on S1 area, and then we have the 103 millisecond response in S2 area. So, but what we tried to do is that you have in the right middle finger pain-related stimulus, and then you take in the left hand a force task for 3 minutes, 30% of the maximum grip what you are able to do, and then it is very tiring, and we did pain-related fields right before and right after the exercise. And here in this these few people what I'm showing, the blue one is before and the right is after the exercise. So in these pain-related fields we don't really, statistically at least, see any difference so far. However, then we looked at the 20 Hertz oscillation, which is known to be in motor cortex, sensory motor cortex, very active, and if there is any change because of the pain-related field. So before exercise in the contralateral cortex, we had a specific amount of 20 Hertz oscillation induced by the pain evoked field. And that was reduced after exercise. And on the ipsilateral side, the same thing. We had a certain amount of oscillation which was reduced after exercise. So we think that we were able to see in this 20 Hertz stimulus-induced oscillation a modulation in the pain with this pain marker what we are trying to develop. So I think that our intracutaneous stimulation produced very specifically a pain-related sensation. Certainly we know that the C fibers should be activated by heat laser stimulation. However, that we were able to get about 50 millisecond first component of this intracutaneous stimulation. I think we were mainly looking at the A delta fiber activation, so not just mixed fiber activation. And what we were seeing in the secondary somatosensory cortex bilaterally was very compatible with previous other methods of looking at the somatosensory processing of pain-related stimuli. So maybe this tool will turn out to be useful. But for the concluding remarks, I just think that the MEG itself is a unique tool, and it can be used for regional studies, like we looked at just motor cortex, and large-scale brain dynamics are also easily to study, and many different applications are possible. There are new developments also in this field, because this helium gantry is of course very difficult to take care of for a long time, and it's an expensive solution. So there is optically pumped magnetometers some people have tested, and they operate in room temperature. So and they should be possible to place directly on the scalp. So there probably is in 5 or 10 years quite different magnetoencephalographic systems available. But what is really a strength, of course, in MEG is that it is completely passive, there is no radiation, and you can go to millisecond level, and your source analysis is much more reliable than in EEG. And many different applications can be used. And I think for this, I thank you and thank my collaborators.